Good evening. Glad to have you back tonight. For those who are here this morning, or if you're here for the first time today, welcome, and we're glad you're here. We have been talking about theology this year on Sunday evenings, and we'll continue that tonight. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about salvation, and the lens through which we've been looking at that is the different words, different terms that are used as part of the idea of salvation. So to remind us of where we've been, so we can kind of see where we're going, there we go. We talked a couple months back about sin and how pervasive that is in our world, how frequently, even when we feel like we have kicked it and moved on, when we've gotten past whatever the problems are, we find ourselves kind of falling back into whatever those things are. And because of that sin that we have, we understand that there is a need for salvation. And then we also understand that that salvation that we want only comes from God. So it's not one of those things where we can do it ourselves. It's not something that we can fix on our own. We rely on God to play the major role in our being saved. And so we need, because of that, to better understand what Scripture says about how salvation comes about, what it means, what God does in that. And we talked a couple weeks back now about the idea of atonement, or if you like the big Bible word, propitiation, one of those good words, which is basically that there is a guilt that we have because of our sin, and God has wrath. And we don't sing a lot of songs about the wrath of God, the wonderful wrath of God. That would not take off. And yet the wrath of God is very much a clear idea in Scripture. We read about it especially quite a bit in Romans, about how, I remember when I took Romans with Jimmy Allen at Harding, he had an outline of the book of Romans that we had to memorize pieces of for different tests. And there was a whole grouping of them that was something that happened and there is no excuse. And it just felt so harsh to think of, and yet it's kind of the message of Paul in Romans, that we have what we deserve and we have what God will give us instead. And so there is this wrath that God has, and he demands something because of that. And so it's his need for justice that says something has to happen there. So if there's a crime that's been committed, a sin that has been committed, then something has to be done to make that right. And then last time, we talked about the idea of redemption, which is that if there is something that is to be purchased, there is a price that purchases that. This is a much more difficult thing to talk about in our world today because everybody wants something for free. Everybody is, well, where can I get this and not have to pay for it? And just throughout most of history, that's not how it's worked. If you wanted something, you wanted to obtain something, there was a payment that had to be made for that. So when you have God's wrath and need for justice, and you have a payment that is to be made while acknowledging the fact that we don't have anything that is worthy of making that payment, we understand that God is very much who we are in need of help from in this whole situation. And so tonight, we're going to talk about the idea of sacrifice. Now, again, this is one of those words that if you had been a person living in Old Testament days, or even in the days of Jesus, hearing the word sacrifice would feel much different than the way you hear it today. Because when we think of sacrifice today, I mentioned baseball last week. One of the things that comes to mind for me is the sacrifice bunt or the sacrifice fly, which if you're not a baseball fan, it's the guy at bat does something where he is going to be out, but in his getting out, he advances a runner or a runner scores, and so he is sacrificing himself kind of for the good of the team. Now, that guy lives on to play another day. It's not a permanent kind of thing like it would have been in the days of Jesus or in the days of the Old Testament. And even when we think of ourselves outside of sports, when we think of sacrificing something, usually it's you're kind of giving up something that you would prefer to have or something that you would like so that someone else can have something instead. I said this morning, I wouldn't talk about the fence anymore, I sacrificed a great Saturday for building a fence. And then, next Saturday we'll come around and it will be fine. We sacrifice things in a very different kind of way. But I want us to think in Bible terms what sacrifice would have meant to them. So what is our introduction to the idea of sacrifice in Scripture? We can go all the way back to Genesis chapter 4. And in Genesis chapter 4, we have these two brothers, Cain and Abel, and we don't really know a lot about their instruction that they're given by God. But what we do know is God is pleased with one and not as pleased with the other because one seems to have followed whatever that instruction is and the other hasn't. It says in Genesis 4 and verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So one of them sacrifices in the way that God wants, clearly. The other sacrifices, and I would guess if you were to go and speak to Cain and Abel before God's reaction and before their reactions and everything that happened, both of them would say, I had these things that I have, whether it be flocks or agricultural things, and I have these things and I'm going to give to God a portion of those. And yet whatever they did in the midst of that was not what God was looking for. God has in the sacrifice an expectation of what it's going to be. So when there's a sacrifice that is given to him, it's kind of important to understand what it is that he wants. In marriage terms, we talk about the idea of the love languages. If you're not familiar with those, it's basically that each of us kind of receives love, understands love in different ways. And so for some of us, we may want to receive gifts. For some of it's affirming words or quality time. I can't remember all 5 off the top of my head, but there are different ways in which you can show your love to someone you care about. But if you're doing it in your language and not theirs, it doesn't have much of an impact. And so if I'm a big gift giver and my wife doesn't care about gifts and I buy big expensive things and take to her, but don't do any of the things that she really cares about more, then she doesn't feel that. So God, in the Old Testament especially, gives a lot of instruction for what a sacrifice is to look like. So if we go further down, in Genesis chapter 8, Noah comes along, he has built the boat, he puts all the animals on it, we make nurseries out of it and all that stuff nowadays, but God saves all these people through Noah and his boat. And when they're finally able to land on dry ground and be excited about being out on earth again, Noah sacrifices. It says Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So Noah comes out of the ark, glad to get, if you've been around that many animals for that long, you probably know how Noah feels to get out in fresh air again. And he is thankful and he celebrates. So there's a piece of sacrifice that is a celebration. Maybe not so much if you're the animal, but for everybody else, there's a celebration that's going on in the midst of that for what God has done and God's faithfulness. Then when we move further down, into Genesis 15, we have Abraham receiving this promise from God of what's going to happen. And in verse 1 it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. So Abram, in this case, is told about the things that are going to come because of his relationship with God and what God is going to do. And later on in the chapter, down in verse 17, he is told Abram to go out and to kill these animals and divide them into two. And then God is going to walk between them as a sign of his covenant, which again, if we saw this unfolding today, we would think this is very odd, but in their day and time, this is how they signified that the covenant was there. And so when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces, representing God moving between those pieces. And then as we move down through the story of Abraham, we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 22. So he had this covenant that was signified by sacrifice, and he finally has the child that's going to be the great nation that's going to come from him. And then in Genesis 22 and verse 1, it says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So he says, I want you to take this son who represents and kind of almost begins this covenant I have with you, and I want you to go offer him as a sacrifice. What do you think if you are Abraham? Now, for God's people, for our God's people, this is not a thing that was done. For the people around them, there would be groups throughout their history in the Old Testament where child sacrifice was actually a thing, and God would condemn it and speak against it and everything. But here in this instance, God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to take your child, and I want you to go to this mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him. What would you think? What would it be like? What would it be like as you're Abraham, and you go back in to try to explain to Sarah where you guys are packing up to go, and what's going to happen? Do you say anything? Do you not? Do you think I'll just come back and explain this later? I can't understand what God's doing. This doesn't make sense. All of the things that would go through your mind. And so Abraham is told, go and take your son, and he's going to be the sacrifice. And so as they're going along, Isaac, being kind of a smart kid apparently, realizes and says to his dad, hey, Dad, I see wood here, and I see the things to make fire here. What I don't see here is the lamb that we're supposed to sacrifice. And what's up? What's going on here? What are we doing? And Isaac realizes there's a problem of some kind. And so as they go along, he asks this question, and Abraham says this. Abraham said in verse 8, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And then they just carried on. So they went, both of them, together. So he says to Isaac, God is going to provide. And again, if I'm Isaac, I probably still have lots of questions going through my mind of exactly what's going on and where we're going and what's going to happen there. And to be honest with you, I don't know that the thing that God has asked Abraham to do is even one of the things entering into my mind. I mean, this is Dad, my dad in old age, who has probably been so thrilled that his son Isaac has come along and probably has loved his son so well that it's hard for him to comprehend what has been asked of him. And yet as they go along, he just has echoing in his mind that God is going to provide this lamb. God will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. So Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain, and he is prepared to do what God has said for him to do. And in the moment where he is ready to do something, his name is called out, and God realizes, as if God didn't realize before, but God sees him go through the motions of all this and knows that Abraham was willing to follow God no matter what the cost. And he said to him in verse 12, do not lay your hand on the boy or anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So he says to Abraham, we've gone through all of this, and I have learned in this process that you have not withheld anything. And as we begin to open our mind a little bit to the idea of sacrifice, maybe one of the first questions we might ask ourselves when it comes to God is, are we withholding anything? Is there something that we feel like, God, I'm willing to give you this, and I'm willing to give you this, and I'm willing to give you this, but we're not going to talk about this. There's something I need to hang on to. And I don't know what that may be for you that you have a hard time letting go of, but for a lot of us, we have some of that. There are things that we are very much willing to give up and do, and yet, do we withhold something? And he learns of Abraham here that he's not going to withhold anything. So in Leviticus, and I promise we're not going to go through a lot of Leviticus tonight, but in Leviticus, introducing the idea, in Leviticus chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it says that the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. So they have now gone through Egyptian slavery. They have come out of it. They find themselves in another place, and God is teaching them what it is to approach him. And for the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, will explain to them all of these sacrifices that they're going to do. And just real quickly, to see 5 of them. They're going to have burnt offerings. So they're going to bring these animals, and they're going to burn them as an offering, and God will smell this great aroma that comes. They will have a gift offering. They will have a peace offering, thankfulness for the peace that God brings, and also kind of a request for peace within their lives. They will have a sin offering. They will have a guilt offering. And as we go through the book of Leviticus and the rest of the Old Testament, these will keep being added to. You think trying to remember Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. We went and changed the time on Wednesday night, and now you have to try to remember what that time is. Trying to remember all these little things along the way that we do. Just imagine all these different offerings and feasts at all these different times that all fulfilled different roles in the sacrifice system of God. But all of these offerings and all these sacrifices, the plans for them were all temporary. And when I read through Leviticus of all the detail and all of those things, I realize how amazing that God creates this system so that people could approach him in a better way. A thing where they had to be fully intentional, and we will read it through modern eyes, and it seems kind of ancient and odd and all of those things. But for a God to go to his people and say, this is the way for you to approach because he wants to be approached, that's nothing that happened within the culture in which they live. It's very unusual for the God who we serve. And so they have this system set up, but it's temporary. And so we reach the book of Isaiah, and we read all about Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 53. When we get to all about Jesus, in Isaiah chapter 53. When we get to verse 10, we read this: "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. He shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." So the intention all along was that Jesus was intended to be the sacrifice for sin. All the way back, when we get to Genesis 3, when there's the one tree they can't eat of and they eat of it anyway. All the way back when we're in Genesis chapter 4, where we read when we started this tonight, and you've got Cain and Abel, and one gets angry about the sacrifice to the level that he kills the other. All the way back to you've got Noah, who is giving this celebratory sacrifice, but all of that came out of everyone on earth had gone so bad that there was just this small group of people that were saved. And then you look throughout the Old Testament, all these sacrifices they would make to kind of push things on down the line and to make things better for a little while, all of it was temporary, and all of it was leading to this, that Jesus is going to be the sacrifice, so much so that they're talking about it hundreds of years before it's going to happen. And so Isaiah tells us Jesus will be the sacrifice. In John chapter 3 and verse 16, we read this morning, but we'll remind ourselves of tonight, and we probably know it by heart. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son." So God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. So God gives Jesus. Jesus was given as the sacrifice for us. So not only is he intended to be the sacrifice, but God actually does it. And isn't it interesting when you think of the language of what we just read? "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son." Does it not echo in your mind from Genesis 22 that we just read? "You have not withheld from me your only Son." And so this thing that is asked of Abraham is something that God is actually willing to do. He's willing to go all the way through with it. God did not withhold his only Son for us so that we could be with him. And then in John 1:29, as Jesus is coming down near John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And echoing in my mind from Genesis 22 again is, God will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. So God did not withhold his only Son, as he allowed Abraham to do, even though Abraham was willing. And then beyond that, God provides the lamb. God has provided the lamb for the sacrifice. And then in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 26 and 27, we read this: "For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens." And all this sacrificial system that God's people had in the Old Testament, where they're picking out the best of the lambs, the best of the animals, the best of the things to give to God. And now we have the best person who has ever been, who is holy and unblemished and unstained. And here he comes, and it says he has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. So not only does God give him as the sacrifice, but Jesus offered himself up as the sacrifice. He went willingly. This was not a Jesus that was dragged there for us, even though in the garden he prays if there's another way, but he knows there's not, and he goes anyway. How often into the unpleasant thing, just the unpleasant thing, do we almost have to be kind of dragged kicking and screaming to get there? How many things are we unwilling to be a part of, we don't want to do? And I as I was thinking about this tonight, I go through so many examples in my head, and they all seem so small by comparison. Those things that we try to run away from, we don't want any part of. I think of when we lived in Oregon, we learned very early on that there was a different requirement for shots for our boys at school. And so we learned that these two guys who thought they were done with shots for a long time were going to have to get some more shots. And I was the one who got the wonderful job of delivering that news one day after school. And I put them in the car after school, and I started to drive them to the health department. And almost like this Isaac moment along the road, they were like, "This is not the way home. We're going for ice cream? You know, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, actually, we're going to get shots. Let me out of the car." They don't want to be there. They don't want anything to do with it. And on the one hand, I'm the dad who just knows, I'd like to take them back to school tomorrow, and this is required. On the other hand, I thought if I were them in the back seat, I'd be doing exactly the same thing. Let me out of the car. I don't want anything to do. Jesus did not have to be dragged to this. He knew. And he knew from the very beginning, before there was a tree in the garden, he knew what this was going to be, and he gave himself as the sacrifice. So he was given by the Father, but he also gives himself up as the sacrifice. Then in Hebrews chapter 9, and I mentioned to you this morning, by the way, if you were here, that what we had in Colossians 1, 15 through 20 was almost like the Cliff Notes version of the book of Hebrews. We're going to hit a few of the high points of it tonight because it says so much about what Jesus has done. It says, therefore, in Hebrews 9:18, therefore not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. And do the words echo in your mind as you read that? This is my body. This is my blood of the new covenant. Do this in remembrance of me, as we did this morning, as some of you will do tonight. The idea of blood has always been a part of the plan. And so this is the blood of the covenant God has commanded for you. And so in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And again, through modern eyes, we will look at something like this and it feels archaic or maybe wrong, or I don't know what you may think of it. I think for us who have been in church for a long time, we just kind of assume this is part of it and this is how it works and we get it. For the world around us, they struggle with these ideas because the idea of somebody having to die and there having to be blood, and they don't get all of that. And the Hebrews writer here is making a really good case for this has always been how it works. When there is wrong, when there's justice to be done, there is blood that is a part of the plan, and without this blood, there is no forgiveness. And Jesus knew that in the garden. He knew this and went anyway. In verse 23, it says, thus it was necessary. So because without blood there's no forgiveness, thus it is necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Isn't it neat to think of everything we have in the tabernacle and the temple back in Old Testament days? It's like copies of something that's better. And so if these copies had to be made right, then how much bigger a thing is it for the real things to be made right? It was necessary. And again, if we're going to take God at his word in the inspired scripture, then everything about this plan, this was the way in which things could be made right. And Jesus went along willingly. God gave him willingly. For Christ, verse 24, has entered not into holy places made with hands. And so think of holy places back in Old Testament days. If you remember learning about the tabernacle and the temple along the way, you walk in and you have the holy place where some could go, and then you had the most holy place where only one could go, and only at a certain time of the year. He comes into holy places not made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. And so they would have these men who were priests who would go in and represent the people on the behalf of God. And I don't know about you. I never lived under that system. I don't know what it would be like. But I would imagine there are probably priests as I would know them back in that day and time that I would think, I'm excited. This is the guy that's representing me to God today. And there'd probably be other times that I would think, oh, has it got to be him this year? Do you know that guy? He's not quite what you think he is. Jesus does not go just into this man-made place, but goes before God in heaven on our behalf. The one who is willing to die for us is the one who represents us. And do you not think the one who is willing to die for you wants to represent you well? I mean, he wants God to know how much you are worth. He wants God to understand how much he loves you and how much he cares for you. And he goes before God on our behalf. He goes into holy places, places we cannot go, on behalf of us, because he is the sacrifice who is given for us. Verse 25, nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with a blood not his own. So the high priest couldn't just do it once and say, all right, we're good, we'll move on. There's this once a year thing that would happen in the major times, but there were also all these little times where sacrifices were made and all the feasts that would come along, and it's a constant thing that's happening. And yet what Jesus does, he does one time because he is able to take care of the price forever. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world, but as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. He has come once for all to put away sin. And I don't know about you, but these are the times I read this verse and it just makes me want to cry sometimes to think, he has come once to put away this sin, and why do I have such a hard time letting go of it? Why does it keep coming back up in my life? Why are these things that I'm withholding something I can't let go? And Jesus has come once to fix this, to make this right, and all I have to do is begin to follow in the way that you would have me to go. In chapter 10 and verse 10 it says, "And by that we will have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." So we've had the sacrifice that is given for us, and now we have been sanctified. It says that every high priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. They can make things right for a little while, but they're never going to really fully remove the sin. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So we have been, because of his sacrifice, we've been sanctified or set apart. So when something is set apart, what does that mean? Do you have things in your home, in your life that are set apart? I grew up with my mom doing a lot of sewing early on and then quilting later. There were scissors that you were not allowed to touch because if you were to use those scissors, the quilting/sewing scissors to cut paper, I'm pretty sure that was worse than the tree in the garden or the sacrifice in Genesis, any of those things. And so you just kind of stayed away from those. And of course, like most boys growing up, I found that out the hard way. I had something that needed to be cut for something, and I grabbed these scissors and cut them and left them out, of course. And I heard who used my scissors? And I thought, I had no idea that was a problem. Is that a thing? And I learned, you don't touch these, you don't use these. They were set apart for a purpose. We have lots of things in life that are kind of like that this thing is for this. I mentioned to you before, I do the dishes at our house most of the time. We have a dish drying mat that sits next to the sink for all those ridiculous things people have designed that don't go in the dishwasher. And when I wash them, I put them out on the dish drying mat. That's where they go. I have boys that love to set stuff on that mat, and it drives me crazy. And this is the sanctified mat. Do you not know? It has been set apart for this purpose. So when we in Scripture read that we have been sanctified, what does that mean? God has set us apart for something. Because God just doesn't sanctify and then walk away. God doesn't sanctify without reason. We have been sanctified, set apart for something. So what is it that we are to do? How do we live as people who are set apart? And this is where we'll land tonight. Because sacrifice is important. And I debated a lot about which words to pick in salvation and all that, because I think we have the gist of the idea of what sacrifice is, even though we probably misuse the word a lot today. But if there has been a sacrifice that has made for us, and we have been sanctified or set apart because of that, what does that change for us as we leave here tonight? What does a sanctified, set apart life look like? So starting in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Paul says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." And so Christ gives himself up, and that offering goes before God as a fragrant sacrifice, something that's pleasing to him. And what do? Well, first of all, he says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children." So how do we live in this way? First of all, we are imitators of God. So if you weren't here this morning, one of the things we read is that Jesus was made in the image of God, so there's this invisible God, and we could see his likeness among us and better understand what it is to be in the image of God, or what it looks like to live the godly kind of life as people. So by being imitators of God, since he's invisible and we don't see him, I think naturally we could realize here, let's be imitators of Jesus. So how did Jesus interact with people? What did he do in different situations? How did he care? How did he love? Where was his compassion? All of those things. Or as we have just read about him, he's willing to give himself up for the purpose that God has in mind. So be imitators of God. And then secondly, walk in love. So we as imitators of God are people who are walking in love. And if you'll remember back last fall when we talked about the book of Ephesians, when we see walking, it is regular daily life. God did not intend love for February 14th and your anniversary and a few other assorted places around the calendar year. It's all the time. As we walk, as we live daily life, we are doing what we do in love. So we imitate God, and the way that begins is by walking in love. And then in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So you are to be living sacrifices. So for the sacrifice that is made in the Old Testament days, once that sacrifice is made, that thing is done. And there's nothing else going on from that point forward. For us, what we have been called to do is, because the sacrifice has been made that had to be made, then the sacrifice that's called on from us is to live. And we are to live in such a way that God is pleased by what we do. And I love the language of the Old Testament that talks so much about this aroma rising before God. I think that imagery is there for us. I don't know exactly how aroma and God works. I think it's there for us to better understand what that's like. Have you ever walked into a place and the first thing that hits you is the aroma? And something just pleasant about it. I love walking into barbecue places, especially after living in Oregon for a few years where there were no barbecue places. When I walk into one and immediately I realize I'm going to leave here smelling like this. And it's great. I love when Saturday morning we cook breakfast a lot at our house. I love when I go out to do something on Saturday and I come back in later and it still smells like bacon in there. I guess that's not Old Testament appropriate, but anyway. I love when I walk in and my wife has been baking cookies or brownies or whatever it is. These sacrifices would come before God, a pleasing aroma. I think he's planted that within us. And so are we living in such a way that as God is present in there, it just permeates everything with good, pleasant. Can't get away from it. I love the way those people at Southwest Church of Christ in Ada, Oklahoma are living this out. And so he says to be a living sacrifice, which is a pleasing aroma to him. And then in verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Be transformed. And I debated 14 times with what to say here because there's so many good words in verse 2. One of the things that came to mind for me was be different. Be different than the world around us is. Now, not in such a way that they can't stand being around us, because we can be combative and argumentative and all those things too, and that generally is just unpleasant. When they're like that with you and you don't like it, they don't like it when you're like that with them either. But can you be different in such a way that the world still wants to interact with you and see something different in your life? Luke 2:52, we read that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So he's growing in favor with people, at least in part, by how he lives. So as we are living sacrifices and not conforming, but instead being transformed, living different kinds of lives, then God also is pleased with the aroma that comes of that and sees within us the desire to live out the sanctification he has put in us. So tonight, if nothing else, I don't know if this is one of those jump up and come forward kind of things, or maybe something that may just click in your mind. I hope you will just have a renewed appreciation of the sacrifice that was made for you. Have you ever thought about the fact that if God wanted to, he could have just continued the Leviticus thing all the way to now? you imagine what that would, everybody showed up with your pigeons and your turtle doves and all those things tonight, and could you imagine if that was the life which we lived throughout our lives? Not knowing the love that would come through Jesus' sacrifice? Be thankful for the sacrifice that has been made for you, and because you are thankful for that, live in such a way that it shows. Telling him thank you is just the beginning, and I hope you give a lot of thanks in your prayers. But what if you live in such a way that shows thankfulness for that sacrifice? Tonight, if you did not know a sacrifice has been made for you, it was so long ago. And you serve a God that desperately wants you to come to him. You have a God that has sent his son for you. He has not withheld anything. He has provided the lamb for the sacrifice, and he wants you to come to him. Or if you have done those things, and like we read about in the Old Testament with God's children, you have somewhere gone astray, he wants you back. He provides opportunity after opportunity after opportunity, and just wants for you to reach out and take that and to come back to him. If there's some way we can help you tonight, please come while we stand and sing.